Hey all, welcome to video 2 of Ethics and Business. In this chapter we talk about ethics versus regulation versus law. So here are some aspects to consider when understanding what professional conduct entails. So ethics. So the relevant kind of codes and frameworks and rules that we need to consider as part of this is the IASBA code, the APS 110, and if you're in New Zealand, it's the NZICA Code of Ethics and the NZICA rules. So the IASBA code, the IASBA is essentially what it stands for is the International Ethics Standard Board for Accountants. So what it is, it's essentially an independent standard-setting body that develops and maintains the International Code of Ethics for professional accountants. And this includes international independence standards. So the IASBA is part of the International Federation of Accountants, or IFAC, and it's responsible for setting ethical standards for accountants around the world. So their mission is to serve the public interest by setting high-quality ethical standards and by promoting their adoption globally of the standards. So essentially, these standards that are developed by the IASBA are intended to provide guidance and support to professional accountants in maintaining the highest level of ethical conduct and integrity of the work. So essentially, it's the highest level of framework which applies to international accountants globally. So the rules set out in the Institute of Chartered Accountants and CPA and various other institutions globally are ultimately determined by the framework set out in the IASBA code. APS 110 is the next one. So this is essentially a code of ethics specifically for professional accountants in Australia. So it's issued by the Australian body, which is the Accounting Professional and Ethical Standards Board, which is APESB, which is an independent body that sets ethical standards and related guidance for professional accountants in Australia. And ultimately, the APS 110 is based on that International Code of Ethics, which we talked about a moment ago, the IASBA. So it's essentially taking that framework and applying it to the local market and basically creating a custom local set of rules, which is based on that international framework. Very similar to how AASB is based on, is the local adaptation of IFRS globally. So APS 110 essentially sets out the fundamental ethical principles for professional accountants in Australia, including integrity, objectivity, professional competence and due care, confidentiality and professional behavior, which we'll talk about later. And this code applies to members of professional accounting bodies in Australia, including CPA Australia, CA Australia, or CA ANZ, and also the Institute of Public Accountants, which is the other one. It also applies to accounting firms and their employees. So compliance with APS 110 is mandatory for all professional accountants in Australia. So the NZICA is similar to what we talked about above, the APS 110, except it's obviously customized to the New Zealand market. The only difference is APS 110, it regulates CANZ, and CANZ also includes New Zealand. So for New Zealand, there's a bit of overlap between APS 110 and NZICA Code of Ethics and Rules. Now, ethics is more of a framework. So, if you break this framework, it's not like the government can step in and issue fines and things like that. It's really self-regulation and it's moderated by the body, right? So, for example, CANZ is going to make sure all of its members comply with APS 110 because it's mandatory for those members. And if you don't, then, that you might be called into the CANZ to go to the, ethics committee and see, and they can, maybe do their own fines or own measures, but it's not like the government can step in and give you a fine, right? It's ultimately the body itself of CANZ or CPA Australia, if you're a member of that. This is very different to laws, right? So laws are essentially they're legislation put in place by the government, and these are essentially set out to basically set a number of laws, and if you break those, then there can be civil punishment, There can be criminal punishment, like you can actually be sent to jail. Obviously, you can't be sent to jail if you do anything which is in breach of APS 110, but you can definitely do that for laws, right? So the key ones that kind of interact with this subject of ethics in business, at least in Australia, is the Corporations Act 2001 and ASIC Act 2001. So Corporations Act 2001, this is the primary legislation that governs the operation and regulation of companies in Australia. The Act sets out the legal framework for the formation, management, and dissolution of companies, including rules for shareholder rights and responsibilities, director duties and liabilities, financial reporting and audit requirements, and various regulatory measures for protecting investors and promoting market integrity. So the Australian Securities and Investment Commissions Act is the legislation that establishes the ASIC, so the actual organisation itself, as Australia's corporate markets and financial services regulator. So the ASIC Act, is essentially what gives power to ASIC, the organisation, to enforce the Corporations Act, which is the act we talked about a moment, and other regulation as well. So the ASIC Act also sets out the roles and responsibility of ASIC, including the regulation of financial markets, companies, financial service providers, and the investigation and enforcement of breaches of the law. Okay, so those are kind of the laws and, the broad difference between laws and ethics. Regulations is another category. So regulations are more specific rules or requirements established by government agencies, professional bodies, and other authorities that provide guidance and standards for conduct in particular industries or professions. So regulations are often based on laws and ethical principles, but may also reflect technical or operational considerations. So they're kind of like regulations, but without the kind of ability to kind of follow up. And it may incorporate elements of ethics as well. So there's a little bit of overlap there. Professional requirements are more a minimum requirement by a body. So CA, for example, sets out kind of charter laws and regulations as to, what you need to maintain. For example, CPD, if you're a full CA member, the punishment for, breaching that might be, you're no longer a member, but there's not going to be any like fines or, the government's not going to issue you fines. You're not going to go to jail, etc. And finally, employer and client values, which is another related but different topic, which is essentially the principles or standards of behavior that guide the conduct of an organization or employer. And these may be based on ethical principles such as integrity, honesty, fairness, or could be strategic or operational or even cultural considerations. So those are different. So they're all kind of they're all related: ethics, laws, regulations, professional requirements, employer client values. They're all related but different in terms of how strict they are, who regulates it, what they can do in terms of punishment, whether they're more guidance and framework or strict rules. So hopefully that all makes sense now. Okay, so let's go through some of the detail summarized from the textbook. So laws and regulations require CAs and CPAs as well to report illegal conduct. So this can conflict with duty of confidentiality, right? Which is one of the principles set out. So this is a good example of where there can be an overlap or contradiction between kind of ethics and regulations, right? Because ethics require confidentiality, laws require disclosure in certain situations. So that's where you have this this kind of caveat that in that specific scenario, it's not considered a breach of the code. And similarly, under laws, there's often many protection for those who expose unethical or illegal conduct, i.e. whistleblowers. And this is to try and encourage that behavior and address that issue of fear of penalties or retribution or breaking codes and things like that. And I guess with values, this last point down here, because there can be a difference in values across cultures. So for example, if you're working in Indonesia, it might be commonplace to offer bribes, for example. Or they might just have a very different threshold of what is acceptable generally in terms of values and ethics, etc., versus let's say in Australia, where the bar is a bit higher in terms of how employees and clients and professional body members need to operate. So in the example they've given, it's the same as the one I suggested, which is, in some countries, facilitating payments, which is basically, you pay government officials, it's not really seen as a bribe. It's more part of the natural way that, things operate over there, right? It's similar to paying a levy to the government when you're importing or exporting goods, but, instead of the government, it might be going to an individual who holds power in that area. But in other countries, that's obviously illegal, like Australia, New Zealand, that would be illegal. So some legislation imposes minimum requirements for global conduct, regardless of local laws. So if you're a multinational company operating out of the US who's operating in Indonesia and Australia, you can't operate differently in Australia than you can in Indonesia. It's the highest minimum standard is applicable globally, right? So, you can't do bribes in Indonesia and no bribes in Australia. It's no bribes across the board. So there's some legislation which actually imposes this minimum standard. So, for example, the US Foreign Corrupt Practices Act of 1977 and the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention of 1997. So as a CA or even CPA, you may routinely confront situations where there is pressure or expectation to act in ways that are not in compliance with the code. So some examples could be, a client, maybe you're working as a finance analyst in a company and the CFO is pressuring you to maybe increase the numbers a little bit or change the accruals from what you would normally do in order to hit a certain target because of pressure from stakeholders, the CEO, or maybe even like to hit a bonus. So that's just one example, but there's multiple ways you could experience this day to day. And because of this is one of the reasons that the code is there in the first place, is because it provides a good framework for dealing with some of these key pressures, and it does provide guidance on how to resolve dilemmas. So some of the key pressures within the accounting profession, in addition to the example I gave, could include accountants not being sufficiently independent from client influence, accountants helping clients avoid paying tax, particularly large corporates, accountants cooking the books by presenting false or misleading reports, or partners in firms taking profits rather than looking after their staff. So these are just a couple of examples. Obviously, there's a lot more. Okay, so that's the end of chapter 2. Again, just to repeat what we talked about in the first video, is ethics in business is not anything like the other courses. This is a very short course, 2 weeks. The content is only a fraction of what we typically see in these courses, hence why the videos are much shorter as well. So if you look at our other courses and purchase one of our other courses, don't worry, there's a lot more content than what you're getting with this one. Anyway, we'll end the video there. I look forward to seeing you in the next video for chapter 3.